The dog has served man for centuries. His progress and use have changed with the times, but always he has shown adaptability to specific tasks. In the military field, his tactical value has been recognized for a long time by the armies of other nations. But it was not until the present conflict that our own armed forces began to train and employ dogs for duty with combat units. Under the guidance of the remount section of the Quartermaster Corps, the carefully chosen canines receive basic and specialized training, which toughens and prepares them for definite assignments under fire. Dogs of many breeds rally to the colors. The hunting dog is relieved of his other duties for the duration and begins the grim manhunt after the common enemy. A dog's natural instincts make cover and concealment easy lessons. Kill or be killed is again instinctive. He's fast and elusive, intelligent and willing. His hatred of the foe is complete. Loyalty and devotion to his job are commonplace with him. He asks for no reward. A pat on the back, any little acknowledgement by his master are sufficient. The procedure is for the using branches to supply the men who will train with the dogs they'll bring back to their outfits. All dogs are specially picked for size and usefulness. Each is trained to do a single job. And remember, they're not pets or mascots. They're soldiers, war dogs. The sentry and attack dogs have already proved their worth for interior guard duty. Now you'll meet their brothers in the tactical service. The
Good afternoon. Welcome to the McGowan Theater located in the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. I'm Doug Swanson. I'm Visitor Services Manager for the National Archives Museum, as well as the producer for the Noontime Lecture Series. I hope you'll be able to join us tomorrow on Friday, November 14th for a special noon program. Admiral James G. Stavridis will be on hand to discuss his book, The Accidental Admiral, A Sailor Takes Command of NATO. He will share his insights about NATO, operations, and the personalities of many people such as President Obama and former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Also at noon, but on Thursday, November 20th, Kevin Gover, Director of the National Museum of the American Indian, and Susan Schoen Hario will be here to discuss their book, as well as the Smithsonian's new exhibit, Nation to Nation, Treaties Between the United States and American Indian Nations, and describe the historical process of treaty making with Native nations and how those treaties and relations have been tested and challenged in historical and modern times. To find out more about these and other programs as well as our exhibits, please take one of our monthly event calendars, which you'll find in the racks in the theater lobby, or you can visit our website at www.archives.gov/calendar. Our topic for today is a different type of Veterans Day program, but important nonetheless. Author Rebecca Frankel will tell us about her book, War Dogs, Tales of Canine Heroism, History, and Love. Rebecca Frankel has been writing about war dogs since 2010 in her Friday column called Rebecca's War Dog of the Week. As senior editor of special projects at Foreign Policy magazine, her photo essay, War Dog, is one of the most viewed pieces in foreign policy's history. Her work has appeared in The Atlantic and National Geographic, as well as other publications. She's been a commentator on ABC World News with Diane Sawyer and MSNBC, among others. In 2011, she was named one of the 12 women in foreign policy to follow on Twitter by Daily Muse. So please join me in welcoming Rebecca Frankel to the National Archives.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm sorry we actually had to stop that movie for a minute. I kind of just relaxed and was ready just to watch for the rest of the afternoon. I appreciate everyone coming out in the middle of the day. This is a topic I could talk about endlessly, and I actually might. So when I give these talks, I'm going to be showing a bunch of photos. I thought it would be appropriate to kind of walk, take a meandering walk, a stroll through war dog history, because it is a very deep and rich and wonderful place to be. If I had been able to just write a history of war dogs, it would have been 10 times as big of a book. So again, thanks for having me. How do I bring the photos up? Oh, here we go. There. Okay. So I do work for Foreign Policy magazine, and I have been working there since 2008. And one of the first jobs that I had was to become editor to Tom Ricks's blog. Tom writes about defense, and he was the Washington Post's Iraq War correspondent. So I was a little bit intimidated by him. He's kind of a no BS kind of guy. He's a very serious, a very good journalist. And so when we first started to talk and get to know each other, our exchanges were a little bit brief. And I worked with him every day. And I don't know why exactly, but he told me he had these 2 dogs. And once we started talking about dogs, well, then it was very easy to talk to Tom about anything. And Tom is he is kind of a serious guy. He's a little bit of an intimidating presence, if any of you here know him. And when I saw these pictures of his dogs, I was really surprised because I expected them to sort of match him in some way, but they're very tiny. They're very little dogs, and he started to send me photos of his dogs. And so one day I was looking at photos that come off the wire, and they, at the magazine we look at photos coming from Associated Press and Reuters, the stuff you see on the front page of the New York Times and the Washington Post, and on the pages of FP's website. And I came across this photo. And it surprised me because it was very different than the images I had been looking at on a regular basis, certainly very different than all of the combat zone images I was used to seeing, because everyone in this photo looks very, very happy. They look very relaxed. And you can see those 2 dogs. They're bomb-sniffing dogs. They're there with those Marines. And even this dog right here looks like he's grinning. And to me, sort of seeing the sometimes very sad photos of people either losing limbs or dealing with injuries, or even just on foot patrol. They're sort of distant and removed, but this sort of was some way to relate. It seemed a lot more familiar, and I think it's because of the dogs. And so I showed the photo to Tom, and Tom, of course, loved it. And he said, well, why don't you see if there are any more of these? And I said, oh, yeah, okay, sure. And I hadn't really come across them before, but once I started to dig, I found a lot of photos. And so that's how Rebecca's War Dog of the Week started. That's a title that Tom very generously bestowed to me. And he calls me his chief canine correspondent. So it is a job I take seriously and one that I really love. And so in May 2011, the news that Osama bin Laden had been taken out by this team of U.S. Navy SEALs. And there was this little line in the article that there had been a dog on the mission with them, and this dog's name was Cairo. And so everyone sort of around me thought, oh my God, this is so incredible. There was a dog with the U.S. Navy SEALs. And I thought, well, yeah, why? Of course there would have been a dog. But it occurred to me that, this is not a very widely tread subject, at least it wasn't necessarily in 2011. And then someone asked me if I wanted to write a book, and I said, yeah, sure, I'll write a book about dogs. And so that's how my war dog adventure began. So once I started looking into the history of war dogs, it goes back pretty far. And even much further than it does in the United States, but the United States didn't officially bring dogs into their military until World War II. But that doesn't mean that dogs weren't there on the battlefields along with U.S. soldiers. This is a photograph from the Civil War. It's a Confederate soldier. I don't know the story behind this photo. It's part of the Library of Congress's archive. But there's a dog in the photo. And for whatever reason, the soldier felt that this dog belonged with him. And so that's their portrait together. There's lots of stories that if you look back far enough in Harper's Weekly, or there was an article in the Iowa Daily Register from 1862, I think, that talks about a dog named Doc. And Doc was a stray dog adopted by the regiment, and he went out on all their missions. He wasn't trained to do anything. He wasn't trained to fend off cannons or chase down bullets like you saw the dogs that were being trained in World War II to, even as bullets are being fired at them, they're trained not to be afraid and to continue on. But dogs sort of did this naturally. So Doc, for example, sustained a wound to the chest and his front leg, but he continued on, stayed with his regiment, and so they honored him. And lots of dogs made it into early newspapers this way. And then we fast forward a few decades to World War I. This is a German dog. So the United States did not bring dogs to this war. They came late to the fight. Germany, France, Russia, Britain were already there fighting. But the Germans have always used dogs, and they've used them to great advantage. And the dogs of World War I are particularly amazing for the jobs that they did, but also for how many lives they saved. I think overall there was something like 75,000 dogs that were on the battlefields of World War I, which is a huge number. So you can see here that these three dogs are, there's a little Red Cross symbol on the harnesses that they're wearing. And they use dogs in this way. They were Red Cross dogs, or what they called sanitary dogs. And these dogs were trained to go out into a battlefield after a battle had been fought. They did this under the cover of night because they could move silently. Dogs also can see better than humans can in darkness, and they're also much better at navigating sort of the trenches and the bombed out earth that was left behind after a battle. And what they were trained to do was to go onto the men who were lying either dead or wounded in the field and distinguish between the two, and then take some sort of signal. Either they would rip off with their teeth a little part of their uniform, or they would pull their helmets off. They would take that little piece back to their handlers and then lead their handlers into the battlefield to the wounded men so that they could be rescued or brought to safety. And here they are again. This is during a training exercise. And here they are again on the battlefield. And so here we come to, this is Major Richardson. His name was Edwin Houghtonville Richardson. He was a very famous dog trainer at the turn of the century. He went all over the world to train the very wealthiest dogs. The Sultan of Turkey invited him to bring his guard dogs to train them to keep intruders from infiltrating his palace. And he was actually a very remarkable man in sort of how he understood dogs and also how he understood how to use dogs. He was very progressive. He was 100 years perhaps ahead of his time in terms of how he was training dogs and how he related to dogs. He was sort of maybe one of the first animal rights activists. He believes dogs were sentient beings that deserve to be treated with respect and dignity. He believed that any person handling a dog should be patient, should be kind, should be tolerant, and should always train the dog to associate joy or happiness with their exercises. It was never about correcting them or punishing them, but it was about rewarding them, which the U.S. military uses that system today, but it took them many, many years. It wasn't until the 1980s that sort of attitude started to slowly seep into how they train dogs. But he, as an English citizen, he believed that they should be using dogs in the fight. He had seen the Germans train dogs. He knew that Russians were doing it. He had seen the French messenger dogs, and he petitioned the British Royal Army to bring dogs. And they said no, and they said no, and they said no, until almost the last year of battle when finally they said yes. And once they said yes, they wanted as many dogs as they could possibly have. And of course, it takes a while to get a dog up to snuff. So what his dogs were so famous at doing, and as were some of the French and, again, the German messenger dogs, these are Red Cross dogs, but what he trained them to do was to carry messages. They would wear a metal cylinder on their collar, and they were trained to run certain paths, sometimes at great lengths, up to 20 miles occasionally. And they were trained to forge a path between command and to the front lines. And they were so well trained that they couldn't be swayed. There's a story of one dog who was unfortunately shot in the face. He sustained such a serious injury that his jaw was almost detached. But he continued his mission. He didn't stop until he got to the end. And it's sort of hard sometimes, I think, to hear those kinds of stories because there's suffering involved, but it speaks to the attitude of the dog and sort of their commitment to doing a task and sort of how devoted they are to the humans that they connect to and that they bond with. Something that I believe very strongly now that I've been able to go and watch dogs train, the dogs that are training now or that were training the last few years to deploy to Iraq and Afghanistan, that to me it always seemed that the stronger the bond between the handler and the dog, the better the team performed. And this is something that he knew 100 years ago. And even now in some situations, there are trainers of military servicemen and women who work with dogs who say, don't be too affectionate with your dog. Don't get too close to your dog. This is a functional relationship. We're taking care of the dog, and they're providing us with a service. But I think the handlers that do the best with the dogs and the handlers that I certainly trusted the most were ones who sort of I guess, took up Richardson's legacy and operate on the same beliefs that he employed then. So there he is again with his bloodhounds. And what he and his wife were sort of partners in their dog training endeavors. They had kennels at their house. All their family had, all their children had dogs of their own. And he used to train, before the Royal Air Force or the Royal Military decided to take on dogs, he would train his dogs at home. And they lived sort of, in Scotland, they lived near the sea. And all the neighborhood children would take part in the training exercises, and they would pretend to be the wounded men and women in the fields. So here we are with one of the British messenger dogs, and you can see there's his metal tube and cylinder. The dogs also used to carry these baskets on either shoulder. They would sort of spread out like wings, and they would carry carrier pigeons, which were also used in World War I. So, of course, as it happens, if the dogs are in the same trenches and on the same battlefields that our men and women are fighting, then they're sort of exposed to the same dangers. And this is a Russian dog team, and the dog is wearing a gas mask, and so is the handler. Although dogs sort of had a better tolerance for gas, which is in some ways was why they were so effective at delivering messages, it didn't affect them as greatly. More messenger dogs. And this dog sustained injuries on all four paws. You can see that he's wearing bandages, and he was also gassed. I think his name is Lucky, ironically. But he made it through safe and sound, and the story behind this dog, I think, is that he was back in action as soon as the bandages came off. So dogs also were taken in as pets and mascots. And this sort of, I think, speaks to the therapeutic, cathartic, and sort of the companionship element, of course, that dogs bring along, which is why for so many centuries they've been mascot dogs and kept as pets and sort of morale boosters. This dog is getting a ride on a motorbike. And there, I don't know if you can see him, but there's a little dog sitting on top of that cannon. So these are Australian mascots. There's a cockatoo and a little terrier there. Apparently they were very good friends. And there we have a bulldog sitting next to his master. So now we've moved into World War II. And, the U.S. again was sort of slow to this call. And so it wasn't actually the military that started the wave of bringing dogs officially into the military in 1942, but it was all on the movements and efforts of one woman. Her name was Arlene Erlinger. She was a New York socialite, very big in sort of the dog breeding, dog society, dog kennels of her social class. And as soon as the bombs dropped on Pearl Harbor, she called a reporter who covered war, but also apparently was a very big dog lover. And she called him and she said, "We have to get dogs into this war. We were one of the only countries of the Allied countries who didn't do it in World War I, and we shouldn't fight another war without them." So they approached the military, and the military said, "Okay, we'll set up the dogs for defense, but you have to provide all the dogs." So what they did then is they appealed to the civilian population. And just as families were sending their sons off to war, they also sent their dogs. So what we have here is dogs weighing in for service. And you can see how different all of the breeds are. It looks like we have a St. Bernard and then some very, very tiny dogs. And I love this photo. I think in part it speaks to there may be a war dog within any dog, no matter how big or how small. And in World War II, it took them a little while to figure out what breeds they were. But in the end, they sort of opted for the bigger, stronger, and you're typically more aggressive breeds. In the video, we saw a poodle. But mostly it was Dobermans, Shepherds, or Shepherd mix. They used terriers, and I'm trying to think what other breeds, but we might see some photos. So they also kept extremely good records, which is very interesting. If you look at different wars, the records are a little bit more spotty. But because the dogs were being brought in by civilians, they kept very good track of them because they had every intention of returning them to their families once the war was over. So here we have a service record for Rex, and you can see that they kept track of his breed, but also his temperament. Is he, does he run away? Is he gun shy? Is he storm shy? And you can see that no, so I think that Rex was probably a very excellent candidate. And then at the end, they noted that he has a gentle disposition and he's very intelligent. And here we have another dog. One of my favorite stories that I came across about this sort of civilian donation, the civilians giving up their dogs for service, was that one woman wrote a letter to the Dogs for Defense, apparently after she submitted her dog's number to be considered for service. And she had decided that she changed her mind. And she said, "Thank you, but you can't have my dog." And the reason that she gave was because her husband, her brother-in-law, and I think 2 brother-in-laws actually had all gone off to war. And she said the dog at the house was their only protection, and that she relied on the dog to take care of her children. And she said that, the future generation deserves as much protection as we can have, so thank you very much. I'm going to keep my dog. These are some Marines, and they're lowering this Doberman down from a ship. You can kind of see the harness. So here we have a Doberman keeping watch for his handler while he takes a nap in the foxhole. I read lots of different stories about how Ernie Pyle, actually, the journalist that covered the war so well from the front lines, wrote a story, a few actually, about different dogs. And one of them was that once they came to a new mission, once the other men in the unit sort of realized how the good the dogs were at what they did, they would fight to dig their foxholes quick enough to see who could dig a foxhole for the dog so that the dog would sleep near them. But they were very good, and so you can see this soldier has no problem taking a nap because he feels safe knowing his dog is keeping watch for him. This is one of the funnier pictures, which I thought was just kind of cute. You can see this one dog is, I don't know, I guess he's catcalling the female dog there in the poster. So this is a dog who was shot and wounded, and unfortunately, I think that the caption that came along with this photo said that he did not make it. But the men who watched these dogs get injured, even though it wasn't necessarily a mandate that their lives should be protected or preserved over others, they did it instinctively. There was one story that I came across. The dog's name was Caesar. And Caesar, they were ambushed, and Caesar got shot, and he was wounded, and his handler couldn't find him, and it turned out that the dog just returned to their camp, and he needed to be carried to the medic. And so the handler was tending to the dog, and he was so upset that he wasn't really paying attention to what was going on, and he reached down to try and lift the dog, and he turned around and realized that all the men behind them had taken off their shirts and pulled together a kit so that they could carry the dog to be treated at the hospital. And even though Caesar had taken a bullet to the chest, he survived, and within after a couple of weeks on leave, he was back doing his job. So again, here we see that there are mascots. They're very cute. This is a baby burro. And then they started them very young. I just love this picture. I think the puppy is just a pet, but I think he was already in training at the beginning. So this dog's name is Peppy. Peppy got lost. He didn't go AWOL, but he was just missing for a few days. I think he sustained a wound to one of his ears, but made it back to his handler, and I think he was okay. So I don't know if you can make this out quite yet, but there's the dog right there in the bottom left-hand corner. His name is Chips. Maybe some of you have heard of Chips, the dog from World War II. And then over there in the top left of the photo is General Eisenhower. Chips bit him, although Eisenhower apparently didn't take offense to it. But Chips also has a kind of a great story. He belonged to the Wren family of Pleasantville, New York, and he was known for having sort of a feisty personality. He chased away the garbage men. He frightened away the postman. And he also used to walk their little girl, Gail, who was 8 years old. He walked her to school every day and slept by her desk, which was odd because I didn't see a reason why, but if he was so ferocious on Gail's behalf, I have to imagine that the teachers maybe weren't being kind, but were possibly too afraid to try and shoo him out of the classroom. So when this call came to donate dogs for service, the Wren family thought that maybe Chips wasn't quite right for life in the suburbs, that maybe he would do well in war. So they sent him off. And he did. He became famous right away. He was one of the first dogs to go into Italy. And on the first mission, he overpowered some Italian gunners, even while taking a bullet to one of his shoulders. and he was awarded a medal, which unfortunately was later taken away because the military decided they were not giving medals to animals. But he did become famous, and he made lots of headlines throughout his career, and he made it through the war, and he came back home. The New York Times did a piece about him. They interviewed the Wren family, and they said that, unfortunately, Chips wasn't quite the same when he came home. Mr. Wren said he didn't wag his tail quite as much anymore, and instead of sort of being fearless in the face of crowds, he shied away from them, which I think, of course, speaks to something I can talk about later if anyone has any questions, but they do diagnose dogs now with canine PTSD. They have special medication for it, they have special therapy for it, and I think it would be silly for anyone to assume that dogs can experience the same trauma, the same heat, the same chaos, all the things that are not like home, and all the things that wound our soldiers, our men and women who are stationed overseas in combat zones. Dogs sometimes are affected by it in the same way, and sometimes it depends on the individual dog's temperament, and sometimes it just depends on their experience. So we are now in Vietnam. The one wonderful thing about World War II, and I think it sort of speaks to the celebration and the championing of soldiers and of the military's role there in general, that the dogs were welcomed back home as heroes. I think within the first 3 months, there were something like 15,000 applications to adopt these dogs because they were so heralded, they were so well regarded, even though they had families to return to. People just loved them and wanted to adopt them. And most of them were able to when they came back from war, they had to sort of train the fight out of them a little bit so that they could return to home, whether there were other animals there, whether there were young children, so they weren't a risk to anyone. But most of them were able to make that transition fairly easily. And then we sort of move ahead to Vietnam. And unfortunately what happened is, as happens again and again, hopefully not this time around, but when the United States winds down its wars, and it winds down its troops, its wartime readiness capacity, we have shelved the lessons that we learned with our dogs. So each war we've renewed them and had to relearn them and build sort of up from scratch, which is unfortunate. So the dogs of Vietnam, they did sort of start all over again. They had to figure out which breeds they wanted to use. They had to figure out how they would be useful. But again, once they were sort of on the ground and being utilized with handlers, especially in Vietnam, because they sort of were unprepared for the guerrilla tactics of the Viet Cong. They weren't familiar with the terrain. They weren't familiar with the environment. Certainly that caught them by surprise, but also the tactics. They had snipers in trees, there were mines, there were booby traps. But once they had a dog, usually the scout dogs sort of became the most useful. The patrols started to have fewer and fewer casualties. So here you can see that the dog's leading even through the water. And one of the handlers that I interviewed, his name is Ron Aiello. He deployed to Vietnam with his dog Stormy in 1966. He was a Marine. Stormy wasn't a very big dog, actually. He thought she was too friendly for war, but she was really good at alerting. And so he used to walk her out on missions in the way that he would use the dog because, of course, they had to move very quietly. So if she saw something or sensed danger, she couldn't bark. She was trained to alert on human scent, on the scent of guns or explosives, mines. And so when they would walk silently, sometimes at night, he would be holding her leash and she would be pulling at the end. And as long as the leash was taut and Stormy was moving forward, then it was safe to continue. But as soon as he felt the leash go slack, it meant that something had upset her. And the way he described it to me is that wherever Stormy was looking, he would just lock his sort of sights right between the middle of her ears, and usually that's dead on where the danger was. So if it was a sniper, they would fire. They would use sort of Stormy's ears, perhaps, or just the direction she was pointing as sort of their target. And she never let them down. He did tell me one story about how one commander came over to him and they said, we want you to use your dog. And he said, okay, well, what do you want to use her for? And he said, well, we're trying to intimidate one of the Viet Congs that they had captured. And he said, nah, I don't think my dog's right for that. Stormy was too friendly. She could become protective of him if there was a threat, but if there was no threat, it was all likely that she wouldn't bark on command or become aggressive on command. And he used to have this tug-of-war game that he played with her. So he would growl at her and she would growl back. She was only playing. And so he would growl at her and she would growl back. And so he did that in front of this suspect who was on his knees with his hands tied behind his back, but he said he didn't let her get close enough to him because he was afraid she would lick his face, which might have frightened him, but she would have only been playing. The Viet Cong, of course, had their underground tunnels from villages to villages. The dogs were, of course, very good at sniffing them out. Here we are leading a patrol. This is Ron and this is Stormy. She's kind of tiny for a German Shepherd. But what's amazing, and I find this with most of the handlers that I've interviewed, is that usually there's always one dog, whether it was their first dog or their favorite dog, but one dog that they love to talk about. And for Ron, that dog is Stormy. This is Steve Reichenbach and his dog Major. Steve had what was a pretty quiet tour. He'd had a couple of friends who had been wounded, but he himself didn't experience anything too terrible. And on his very last day there with Major, he was asked if he would go out and lead a mission, and he thought, yeah, sure, okay, I'll go out. So he took Major out, and they were walking. Actually, it was quite a large patrol of people, and Major gave an alert, but it didn't. It was in the middle of the day, and he didn't see anyone. So he decided it must have been a booby trap, and so he was right. Major was right. There was in fact a booby trap, and it was one of these large pits that they would dig, and then at the bottom they would stick these sort of spears, so that if you walked into it unwittingly, you were very likely to fall in and get wounded, if not be killed. So unfortunately, the pit was just sort of a distraction, and around the pit there were these mines. So as they were sort of clearing the pit to see how deep and how wide it was, Steve stepped and a mine exploded in front of him, and it exploded in between his legs basically, and disrupted an artery. So he had to be medevaced out, and Major went with him. And Steve survived, as I was talking to him recently. And Major ended up being attached to another handler. The unfortunate thing about Vietnam is that these dogs, most of them were left there. In sort of the United States military's haste to leave the area and to evacuate, they did not bring the dogs back. Sadder still is that most of these handlers did not know this at all. Of course, they didn't know it in advance, but certainly it took many, many years for them to find out what happened to their dogs after. Ron Aiello told me that he wrote the Marine Corps for years and years because he wanted to adopt Stormy and bring her home, and he wasn't able to do that. And when he talks about it, Ron is an incredibly warm, friendly guy. He's very jovial. He can talk about the Vietnam War, and you think it's like talking about a good movie he saw. He really doesn't register too much pain. He speaks with it with a lot of distance. I think that many of the men and women that I talk to who are serving in Iraq or Afghanistan don't quite have yet. But when he talks about Stormy being left behind, that changes. And here we have Nemo. You can see that Nemo is missing his right eye. And he got this injury in Vietnam. He and his handler, Robert Thornburg, were walking through on a patrol on one of the bases, and they were ambushed. And during the firefight, Thornburg let him go, and so he surged on to their attacker. And in the interim, the handler was shot, and Nemo made his way back to him. And when he did, he climbed on top of him and covered him with his body to protect him, which is kind of an amazing thing because they don't train dogs to do that. And in fact, when a handler is wounded in battle, the dogs that are super protective of them, it can be a hindrance to them getting help. So when a dog climbs on top of a handler's body after he's been shot and he's barking and sort of ferociously protecting this person, when the medics are trying to get help, it's a hindrance. But what I think is remarkable is that they don't train dogs to do this, but instinctively they understand that something is wrong, and they put themselves between the threat and the person they're protecting. Both Nemo and his handler survived, by the way. And so this is a photograph from Iraq. The handler up there is an Air Force handler. His name is Sean Lulavs, and the dog with him, his name is Aslan. And they were one of the very first teams to go into Iraq in 2004. So when U.S. forces went into Iraq in 2003, we didn't send a very large contingent of forces. And again, like in Vietnam, The program had been scaled back. They didn't bring the dogs back. It wasn't discussed in the public. And certainly a lot of the advantages that they had learned in Vietnam, which could have been applied very usefully in Iraq, because the single greatest hindrance or obstacle that they found on the ground once they got there were IEDs, or improvised explosive devices. The United States did not even have the right kind of armor, the right kind of protection for their convoys, to deal with roadside bombs, to deal with all of the sort of small pressure plate bombs or the cell phone activated bombs that were being used when they initially sort of went in. And so what Sean will tell you is that they had to sort of learn this on their own. These dogs were not trained to sniff out roadside bombs. They were not trained to they could sniff out explosives, but certainly they hadn't done foot patrols, which is what they ended up being used for. And so the 30 teams, they were Marine and Air Force teams that landed there a year later, didn't know what they were doing. On their very first night on base, in fact, Sean was taking Aslan out for a walk, and the dog was sort of doing his business, running around, sniffing at everything. He wasn't working. And then all of a sudden, Sean was watching him, and he noticed that his sniffing got much more intense. And he thought, okay, oh, now what could that be? And he thought, well, they were sort of in an area that had been occupied before. There had been some fighting, so maybe he was picking up residual odor. But in fact, he wasn't. There was an IED. It was made of a can, and it had just been laying around like a bit of trash, and it was actually on their base. So Aslan alerted to it, which was very lucky for all the men who were staying there. So this is actually a different kind of a dog. I don't know if you can see her. She's the black lab down there. Her name is Bo, and Bo is a therapy dog. And in 2005, the Army partnered with an organization called America's Vet Dogs, which is a service dog foundation, and they're part of the Seeing Eye Dog Foundation. And they had this idea that dogs offer a lot of catharsis. They are used in therapy. This sort of wave of using dogs in therapy started. Actually, Sigmund Freud used to bring his dog into the room with him, and he would use the dog as sort of a gauge. If the dog was seen to be sort of upset or ill at ease, then it meant that his patient wasn't relaxed. And then in the 70s, there were other psychiatrists who sort of noticed this relaxing effect that dogs would have on their patients, and they started to bring them in not very sort of official way, but just as a presence. And so the handler there, her name is Captain Nahara. She and Bo both received combat training in order to deploy, but their job was to be there as a therapy team. And she started to notice that people would come up to them just to hug the dog, just to pet the dog. Bo actually became an exercise partner for one of the servicemen who were over there who had gained a lot of weight. He was a little bit depressed, and so because so many people were giving Bo treats, Bo had gained a lot of weight. And so Nahara suggested, well, Bo actually needs some exercise. Maybe you could take her for runs. So Bo helped, it's not exactly what you would think in terms of prescribing medication or all the other sort of tools that they use to deal with PTSD or to help combat PTSD. But this idea to bring dogs in was sort of revolutionary, and she says she believes very much that it made a difference. But one of the things about Bo that Nahara noticed after they'd been there, they had a particularly long deployment. The Army tends to deploy for a little bit longer than some of the other service branches. So they were there for 15 months, which is a long time. And she said by the end of their deployment, Bo, who was never really like a super social dog, but she was just very gentle. So if anyone ever came up to her, she was certainly very friendly, but she wouldn't run and seek out attention. Nahara said by the end of their tour there that Bo had had too much. She had sort of absorbed too much sadness. And she started to turn away from people when they wanted to sort of hug her or pet her. And she said she was only really happy when she was free to be a dog. So I think there's a lesson in there on many different levels. But certainly I've heard stories from handlers who have told me that for whatever reason, other people that they were serving with would use the dog in sort of the same way. Sean Lulof's, the photo we were just looking at, he had this role. He was most often sort of partnered on missions with Marines. And he had a rule about Aslan, who was not always a very friendly dog, that no one could pet Aslan or try and play with him while they were working, that if he was working, he had to be allowed to be in that mindset to focus and to concentrate. But as soon as the missions were over, he said, you guys can play with him, he's free. And Sean told me that they had a lot of bad days. Sean's not a very emotive person, but what he said was that bad days meant that a lot of people had gotten killed. And he said after one very, very bad day, they were sitting around waiting to get picked up to go back to their base. And he was with some Marines, and he said they were all just sort of sitting quiet as they had lost a few people. And he said he watched as one Marine just sort of broke down and cried and just put his head on his dog's shoulder. So here's Bo again. This is a young Iraqi girl. Part of what Nahara would do with Bo is she would bring her around to the military hospitals. And the military hospitals don't discriminate or distinguish between insurgents, soldiers, anyone who is wounded in war, they take care of them. And this girl's parents had been killed in a firefight with U.S. soldiers, and she had taken she had sustained a very bad wound. She took a bullet to her abdomen and was in the hospital for months. And because the culture around dogs in Iraq is a little bit different, dogs are not pets. They're sort of seen as not necessarily filthy, but they're not brought into the home. They're not pets. Also, during the Iraq War, Baghdad had a horrible rabies problem and sort of dogs that would roam around in packs that were very dangerous. So she was very careful not to bring the dog near the Iraqi patients because she thought that it might be sort of disturbing to them. And this particular girl, when she was in bed, she seemed very afraid of the dog. So Captain Hara was really careful to not go into her room or near her bed. And one day, one of the nurses came up to her and said, I think it would be really great if you could bring Bo over and visit this girl. And she said, no, she seems really scared of the dog. And the nurse said, no, I don't think so. They had been giving her Play-Doh, and they'd noticed that she was making every day these little statue of dogs. So she slowly started to bring the dog over to the girl's bed, and little by little she became less afraid and more comfortable, to the point where she would laugh when Nahara would do tricks with the dog, just to kind of make her smile. And as she healed and got better, by the time she was up and walking, she got to take Bo for walks. So it really helped her come out of her shell. I think it helped sustain her physical therapy that she was getting because she wanted to be with the dog. She wanted to take Bo for walks, which was a story that I liked very much. So this dog's name is Taint, and that's his handler, Chris Jacobin, who was for many years the kennel master at the U.S. Air Force Academy Kennels. And I have this photo in here. Jacobin never deployed to a combat zone, which is something he has very mixed feelings about. He has children and a family, and so he was sort of on some level happy that he didn't deploy, but on another level he felt like it's the ultimate experience as a handler to be using a dog. So Taint was not the friendliest dog in the world. Jacobin was actually the only person who could ever handle him. He mauled a handler who probably was trying to do something with the dog that he shouldn't have been doing so badly that they were ready to put the dog down. And Jacobin pleaded with them and said, please don't put him down. He's my dog. I'll take care of him. I'll be able to control him. And so their story is really interesting because all dogs are deployed from home station. It's a little bit different than human service members who will get assigned to a base for a few years and then they get reassigned to a different base. Dogs live in the same kennel for most of their lives unless there's special circumstances where they get transferred, like Taint, who got transferred over to Jacobin's care because he was the only one who could manage him. And their story is interesting because they were together for 10 years. But part of what war dogs do, of course, Jacobin will tell you this, he's one of the best handlers that I came across. He's also the most humble. He will tell you that a dog's first job is to be a deterrent. So clearly this is very deterring behavior. I don't know that many people would willingly approach this dog. And he doesn't have to do anything. He doesn't have to release the dog. He doesn't, just by being there, he's seen as a threat. But these dogs are trained to bite. The military employs two kinds of dogs, dual-purpose dogs and single-purpose dogs. And Taint is a dual-purpose dog, which means that he is trained on either scent work, which means he can find explosives or drugs, And he's also trained on patrol work, which means that he is bite training and that he is trained to protect his handler, which means he's trained to chase someone down and bite them. This was part of my research. I let myself get bit, not by Taint, by a different dog who was a little bit nicer and a little bit smaller. But the way that they do it, and you could see in the video that we were watching before, is they were sort of provoking the dog and then letting the dog bite their arm. And so the way that they do this is they first wear very big, very bulky protective suits, and the dogs learn to grip onto an area that gives them the most advantage. So if they're running after a suspect and they grab onto the back of their arm, if they're running very fast, and maybe you've seen videos of this, it's really incredible to watch, but when they're running and they run very fast and they sort of take a launching leap and grab onto something, that momentum is so strong that it'll just bring someone down to the ground. And a very well-trained dog, which most of these dogs are, will out or bite on the command of their handler. So no matter how frenzied they are, how excited they get to bite, because sometimes for them it's I don't know, I sort of felt like I was a chew toy or something, and when the dog saw me walking out in the suit, he got really excited. Yes, but it hurts, let me tell you, even with a bite suit on. So this is a photo that I love just because to me it shows how much love there is between a dog, and that even the sort of toughest or most stoic Marine or Special Forces guy, like, I think that they have these moments with their dogs. There's lots of stories about dogs laying down their lives for humans, but there are, I assure you, plenty of stories that show the other end of things. Not to end on a sad note, but a quick story. There was a Marine who was stationed in Afghanistan, and it had nothing to do with fighting, but there was a fire in the barracks that they were living in. And he managed to get himself out, but he couldn't find his dog, Tosca. And then he heard her barking, and she was still inside the building. And he ran back in to get her. And unfortunately, neither of them made it out. But what spoke, in addition to that sort of heroic act and an act of just sort of instinctive love, I think, is that his best friend waited for 10 hours and sat in the veterinary station until the dog's body was cremated so he could bring her remains back on the same plane that they were bringing Sergeant Frankel, the handler's body, back, because he knew that they didn't want to be separated. And the family buried them together. So I think I will stop there because I think I'm running out of time. But if anyone has questions, I'm happy to answer them.
You mentioned that in World War II, so many dogs were brought back, but in Vietnam, not as many. How about the Korean War? Was it more like the Vietnam experience where they weren't brought back or not?
They didn't use very many dogs in the Korean War. They used some. So I think that they were brought back, but the numbers weren't significant either way.
Hi. This is more of a little story I want to tell you, because you showed the picture of the Confederate soldier with the dog, and I'm a Civil War reenactor, and there's a story of a lot of regiments had dogs, but there's the 11th Pennsylvania had a dog named Sally, who was basically a Staffordshire Terrier, a pit bull. That dog served with the regiment through almost the entire war. She marched with the regiment. She answered the bugle calls. At Gettysburg, she got separated from the regiment after the first day, and at the end of the battle, they found her standing guard over the dead of the regiment. So there's one monument at Gettysburg, the 11th Pennsylvania, that has a dog on it, and she's on the monument.
I'm gonna have to go see it. Thank you.
And she was killed. She was killed right at the end of the war. She was wounded once, and then she was killed at the end, and they buried her.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. I didn't know about Sally. Thank you. Are there any other questions?
Can you give us a little bit of information about Rin Tin Tin? I understand that...
I might be the wrong author. I think Susan Orleans might be your woman for that. I don't know very much about Rin Tin Tin, other than that there were many, many Rin Tin Tins. and that he was probably one of the richest dogs, maybe in history, but I really don't know very much about him.
Okay, because I know that they found the dog in France during World War I, and that an American soldier brought the dog back to the United States and somehow got him into the movies. But then during World War II, one of the future Rin Tin Tins was used as far as getting the American population to turn over their dogs to the military.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. I think it was really hard to give their dogs over. I'm sure I would have a very tough time with it. Hi.
Do soldiers bring their family dogs, their own personal dogs, or are they all dogs that are trained that then become?
No, the dogs are all trained and they're procured and purchased by the military. There's very specific breeders that they work with. Most of them are European. I think most of the dogs, the breeds that they used are primarily for the dual-purpose dogs. They're Shepherds and Belgian Malinois, and I think most of the dogs are coming out of the Czech Republic these days. But one of my World War I stories that I like very much is that a lot of the men who were fighting in Europe for the British or the French, they weren't that far from home. So even if it was a few days' journeys, some of their home dogs actually would track them down and follow them because they had left, and they sort of had to shoo them away and try and get them to go back home again. But I always sort of like that. Sorry.
Go ahead, try it, Chris. It's muted, probably.
I think is it on?
There you
Yeah,
go.
no, it's on. My father had a dog that went to war from Pennsylvania. They were from Pittston, and his name was Peanuts. And I wondered, how would I find out the information as to what happened to him? Or I saw, in the earlier part of your program, you said that they kept very good records.
They do. What branch did your father serve?
My dad was in the Air Force, but I'm not sure what branch Peanuts was in. He didn't
Okay.
serve with my dad. My dad was a young boy. He was the youngest of his family, and the dog belonged to him, and he volunteered his dog to go. So I just wondered, my dad is still living, and I thought that would be kind of a nice thing to find out for him.
Yeah, the Marines in particular have really great archives. So does the National Archives. The Library of Congress does as well. Afterwards, I'm certainly happy to get your email, and then I can send you my contacts at these different archives.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
So I hear that, I'll speak to
Okay, can you hear me, guys? Okay, so I've been reading some articles where the dogs are considered equipment, and when their handlers are sent, they finish their tour or whatever, the dogs stay there, and that, and do another tour without their, current handlers, and they go on to a new handler. And it's really difficult for the original handler to get that dog or adopt them. What have you learned about that in your research?
So that's actually absolutely not true. It is too bad, to put it delicately, that there are even some reputable publications who have been publishing these stories. One of them in particular just came out in USA Today and the National Journal. It was written by the same fellow who did a poor job fact-checking before he wrote. So the dogs are not left behind. And there's a few reasons for that. The first is that the United States military invests a tremendous amount of money and time and energy into training them. So they're, even in the most sort of bare bones and cold kind of calculation, they're very important, sort of special. So the military has a lot at stake. So none of these dogs would ever be sort of left behind. For that reason alone, of course, the handlers would never allow this to happen. So the way that it works is that all dogs are assigned to a home station, and they deploy and return from that home station. But the dogs and their handlers always deploy as a team. So whatever the mission is or wherever they're going, they go as a team and they return as a team. I met a young man, his name is Joshua Ashley, or was, I should say. I spent 2 weeks at this pre-deployment training course that's run by the Marine Corps in Yuma, Arizona. And he deployed for 2 from Camp Lejeune. He was a Marine with his dog Sirius, and another handler in the same unit, Kent Farrell, deployed with his dog Zora. And while they were over in Afghanistan, they both went out, on different missions. And unfortunately, Zorro was killed, and Joshua Ashley was killed. So what happened is that Kent Farrell took over being Sirius's dog, and even though Joshua Ashley had been killed, the dog was returned with the same unit when they all went back, and he was looked after there. So this notion that dogs are treated or even looked at as equipment, or even in some capacity written up in papers as equipment, I wrote sort of a rebuttal article to that one, and I interviewed the program manager for the Department of Defense, and he sounded sort of very tired and exhausted about talking about this, but the way he said that he went back through all of their manuals and searched, because in response to this, he wanted to go through and strike out any instance where dogs were even written of as equipment, and he said he couldn't find anything. And so I think it comes from a couple of different places. I think, unfortunately, the stain of what happened in Vietnam kind of lives on a little bit, and there's confusion between military working dogs and then the private companies that are out operating in combat zones that have, they're called CWDs, or contract working dogs. And the Marines actually employed this dog because he's a Labrador, would have been one of those dogs that came from a contracting firm. It's called K2 Solutions. It's in South Carolina, and there are other ones in the United States. And they're just bomb-sniffing dogs. So in the mid-2000s, the dogs proved to be so useful that the military just didn't have enough to send into combat. So they hired these other firms to train single-purpose dogs, just bomb-sniffing dogs. And they employed them. And the way it was explained to me a little bit is that the contract working dogs, not military working dogs, they're a little bit like rent-a-cops. So you hire the handler and the dog. And the military, in their contracts, as far as I've been told, has specifications for the treatment of the dogs, but their oversight into how those dogs are treated only extends so far. So I know there are some instances, there are people who, the military working dog community is surrounded by an incredibly devoted and passionate group of people. Some of them are former handlers, some of them are families of handlers, some of them are just, dog activists and dog lovers, and so they're helping to, get these contract working dogs who are still out there but not being used back to the United States, but it's very separate from the military dogs. So, and it's strange, I still see things, cropping up all over Facebook and on Twitter, and I think it all comes from a very good place. People are concerned that these dogs are being treated well, but in terms of the military's treatment, it's just not true. I'm happy to say it's not true. I see.
When a person enlists, may they request to be a handler, or what is the process that an individual can actually work as a handler?
Yeah, so it's a specialty, like any other thing in the military. It used to be incredibly, incredibly difficult because the jobs were so much fewer than there are now. There was a very, very high demand when we were deployed in both Iraq and Afghanistan for dog handlers. So what was sort of a long, laborious, very tough process in order to get approved. They used to have to write these long essays and go before a board and take all of these exams. And there's still some of that now, but it's the older handlers, the guys who were the first ones, sort of look at the process now and they're like, it's so easy. It's not what it was like when I was going through. But yeah, so in the case of this photograph, or in the case of the Marines and their sort of what I call like the supplemental dog surge program that they provided, they paired the Labradors with infantrymen. So they only had a little bit of training. They weren't technically, not that they're not dog handlers, but they didn't have the same extensive dog training school stuff. And they paired them with infantrymen because the dogs were so gentle. So they couldn't have paired them with, say, like a patrol dog or a dog that was incredibly aggressive or hard to handle. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
Folks, there is a book signing one level up at the Archives bookstore.